As you can see on the screen, the title of her talk is Putting Principle into Practice, Transparency, Recording and Artificial Intelligence. So, Jenny, please.
Moving over, hang on. Right, everyone. So, first of all, thank you to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. And obviously, secondly, an apology. My apology is that this is going to be quite a personal talk. I've been looking at AI for too many years now, and it's all got a bit jumbled in my head. So I'm using you as therapy, and I'm using you as an opportunity to try and unpick it in my head a little bit. I'm doing this just because I have to, or my head will explode, but also because I think it's more honest. I do get asked to speak on this subject quite a lot, and I'm worried now that people think I'm some kind of expert. And I want to say I'm not. I'm really, really, really not. I may have done more reading about it than perhaps some people, but I haven't done anywhere near enough for me to think that I can claim any kind of expertise. And I may have found myself in various contexts where I've had the chance to kind of explore some of these issues, but again, nowhere near in the level of detail that I would like to be able to sort of confidently claim that I've done any research in this area. I sort of, I need to think about it, and I am thinking about it, and that's what we're going to do. But you'll also be pleased to know that I'm not going to be a complete ramble. I am also going to try and bring some structure, if I can work the laptop. Yeah, here we go. And also try and address the themes that the organisers have given me. So I'm talking about transparency, record keeping and AI, and you can see I've kind of done a Venn diagram. And one, explainable AI, is perhaps where my journey started. So that's where we're going to start too. And that's where sort of my journey started. Then number two is around documentation. That's the second theme we're going to talk about. So number two is perhaps where I like to be, where I feel most comfortable. And then number three, which is technology assisted archival processing, that's probably where I find myself ending up to some extent. In fact, I'm not sure I haven't always been there, to be honest. So that's the sort of journey that we're going to take. And like I say, I will try and keep it short and not too self-indulgent, but apologies if it gets that way. So this is where I started. In 2019, I was working at University College London, and obviously AI was really exciting, and it was all the news, and there was some money available for something under our Grand Transformation Challenges funding. So I applied for that, and we ran a workshop. We ran a workshop on human-centered explainable AI. And the most interesting thing for me, perhaps, that came out of that workshop was exposure to alternative perspectives to some extent, because it gave me the opportunity to kind of invite people to come along to this workshop from different fields and different areas. And before everybody arrived at the workshop, they were also asked to kind of write a position paper or a sort of very short sort of perspective on AI or explainable AI from their kind of field. And those are all available still if you want to read them. And it was very interesting, just to start with, to hear those different perspectives. Then we had the workshop, and what came out of the workshop were these kind of three, I don't know, they're not really findings, they're more this is what we ended up talking about to some extent. And the first thing we ended up talking about in that was that there were lots of people there who actually knew what AI was, unlike some of us in the room, and they were getting very cross that we were just sort of not seeing the full picture of AI, that we were all pretty much had this sort of vision in our head that AI was machine learning, and they're sort of going, it's not. There's much more to it than that. We need to, you need to understand what you're talking about before you kind of start talking about explaining it. And then the other thing was that it was that theme that came out most, explanation and explaining, and this concept of what is an explanation. It's a contextual human behavior. It cements trust. And also this idea with the changing the metaphor was that we don't always need as detailed an explanation as, sometimes we do. Sometimes it's perfectly all right to just sort of look at the pretty iceberg floating on the surface. Sometimes you do need to kind of dive into those depths, and what sort of context is that the case? So, my car works. I don't really know how it works. I couldn't explain it in a lot of detail, but does it really matter? It's that kind of question around, when do we need an explanation? What depth of explanation do we need? And that's what that kind of change the metaphor idea came from. So that's where I started. And obviously, it was very interesting from there to where I went next. So obviously where I went next, being an archivist, is history. So basically what they were saying was, you don't know what artificial intelligence is. So I did then sort of get diving into the history, trying to understand where the field was coming from. And we have here this quote about kind of, one of the earliest workshops in this area, and what they were sort of trying to do. They're sort of trying to explore this hypothesis that, any aspect of learning or feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. So that's kind of where it came from. And so I learned about, the AI winters, and I learned about expert systems versus machine learning, and tried to sort of unpick that a little bit. And obviously I felt comfortable there because it's history. But that doesn't mean that I think I probably do now have a slightly better understanding of artificial intelligence. And I do still kind of, when I'm asked to define it, I think this is probably my favourite definition, because it gives that kind of idea that it is a research field. It is a long-standing academic endeavour to kind of explore this hypothesis, but it's also kind of where it's going, that kind of where it's, how it's being used. And it's being used to do this kind of creating systems that are capable of performing tasks commonly thought to require intelligence. That's where it's sort of directed. So there's the kind of idea of the field, and then there's this kind of where it's directed. And where it's directed is, very much, generally speaking, into kind of trying to define these systems that can do stuff for us, that can perform tasks. So robotics is kind of an early spin-off to some extent from artificial intelligence. It's still sort of in the picture. But obviously with machine learning, we're getting into these kind of companies who are sort of selling us things like, fraud detection, which we've been talking about earlier, knowledge mining, document process automation. So these are the kind of tasks, if you like, that we're sort of being told. So we're also engaging here in industry. We're also engaging here in application. So yes, there's an academic field, but it's also this kind of way in which it's applied in this direction into that. And that's also where I kind of found myself going, thinking about that. And sort of realizing that there perhaps is more to it. They were right. There is more to it than just machine learning. The other thing that came out of this sort of talk, and that sort of I kind of encountered at this point, was this distinction that was being made in the explainable AI literature about a difference between explainability and interpretability. And I have to say, I'm still not entirely sure I could give you a very sensible explanation of what that means to everybody else. I think what it means to me is perhaps a difference between how you're looking at the AI to some extent. You can see there a quote from machine learning has become alchemy. So that's actually coming from the field. That comes from a sort of a speech that was made at NIPS, which is Neural Information Processing Systems, which is one of the kind of main conferences in this sort of field. And that's coming from the field itself. And, and that's where I think interpretability was sort of there. The field itself was realizing perhaps that they were now developing models that they didn't necessarily know how they work themselves to some extent. There's quite a sort of competition-driven kind of development ethos in that academic sphere. It's all about sort of demonstrating that whatever you've developed is better than what everybody else has developed against some arbitrary benchmark. But actually understanding what was going on, interpreting what was going on in the system wasn't as important. And this is where I started as well. So I could begin to see a connection here with record keeping that wasn't necessarily about transparency, but was about this kind of, what does it mean to explain or to open something up? Is it enough to just know how it works, or is it about knowing why it works that way? And this is perhaps this difference between explainability and interpretability that I came to, in as much as I think there is a difference between, if you want to know what a system does and sort of how it acts. And there's a sort of subtle shift there between kind of crediting with intelligence and not crediting with intelligence. If I see AI as performing a task, I want it to be interpretable. So I want to know how it has performed that task, or how the system works, or if you like, the mechanics, right? If I'm moving towards explainability, I'm thinking more about rationale. I'm assuming that this system has a rationale, that it has an intelligence, that it sort of that's the difference. And I think this also made me think about records management and record keeping, perhaps, and the way that, you know, we have this role to sort of open up the reasoning, if you like, of these large bureaucratic organisms, which can, let's face it, look as much like a black box from the outside as any AI. And it's this kind of question around rationale, perhaps, versus mechanics. So this was something that I came to, and I have written some stuff on this. This was the one occasion when I actually wrote some of this down. I'll just put that in any case anybody's interested. And then I think on this kind of mechanics versus rationale side of it, the other thing that I've done and the other thing that I've sort of tried to get into is sort of actually looking at that mechanics, looking at the mechanics. But I quite often end up more on the rationale side, because I look at that, that's a confusion matrix, if anybody is wondering. And that is one of the ways in which you kind of see what's going on under the hood, perhaps, or how the AI is classifying something and where it's misclassifying things and where it's sort of finding it difficult to classify things in the correct place. But it's just numbers to me, right? It's so what it reminds me is that, you know, the AI is just working on a completely different worldview. It's working on the basis of numbers and statistics. And I am trying to understand more of the mechanics. I did indeed fall asleep reading my chapter on linear regression last night, which was not unusual. Okay, so I am trying to understand that, but I think it's also, to be honest, that interests me less than perhaps, again, where an archivist would be expected to have a more natural kind of comfortable position, which is the representation that goes into this. So if the machine is having to have the world converted into numbers so that it can process them in this statistical way, it's more about the basis on which that representation is being created. So this is things like the vectorization that's going on that feed into these kind of techniques. So I will admit, I'm afraid, to a limited interest in statistics. I am struggling through it, but I think where my attention in this terms and perhaps the mechanics is much more interested is on this representation side and how the world is being converted into a numerical form such that it can then be parsed by these kind of new systems. On the explainability front, where I'm ending up perhaps is more in terms of, you know, again, it's a safe zone. It's like, oh yeah, if you're going to do explainability, you need to have documentation, you need to have records. This is a nice safe space, and perhaps this is what we can do as record keepers. We can just sort of, you know, look at this, play to our strengths. Yeah, we know records, so let's play to our strengths. At about this time, I had a shift in context, so I will admit I moved from UCL to the National Archives. While I was at National Archives, I was not involved in, but I obviously became rapidly aware of work that colleagues had done there on the AI for digital selection. Whilst I was there, I was also kind of drawn into pilot of the algorithmic transparency standard. So this is a new, it's now called the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standard. And this is a new government standard around sort of documentation, if you like, for algorithms in use in government. And so I was also at the time then drawn into Paris Trust AI. So Paris Trust AI is a major sort of interdisciplinary project. It's a research project run by University of British Columbia, Luciana Durante, if anybody's heard of her. And this is sort of the context in which I was operating. And so from there, I sort of then maybe got not sidetracked, but where I went next, if you like, is into that safe zone around documentation and audit to some extent. Sort of the bread and butter, if you like, of records management and knowledge and information management, questions of governance, questions of audit, questions of documentation. And I've been spending a little bit of time sort of getting to grips with some of the documentation that the kind of machine learning and AI field is sort of creating itself. So you can see here that, you know, places like Microsoft and Google and various other places, sort of big players in this space are sort of seeing the value perhaps in these kind of data sheets or model cards in documenting what they're doing. And so this doesn't surprise me, you know, if you're going to kind of want to explain yourself or be held accountable or sort of offer yourself up for accountability, you need documentation, and this is what they're doing. It is interesting, though, from a different perspective, and if you feel like it, I would recommend looking at some of these and trying to complete them. So what I did, for example, with the data set, data sheets for data set, is I tried to complete one for the Web Archive, National Archive. So I said, what happens if I conceive of the Web Archive of the National Archives as a data set rather than as a web archive? And I try and complete this set, this sheet and this information. And it's quite a good way of perhaps helping you make a mental shift in the way that Stephanie and Adam were talking about this idea of archives as data sets, of the kind of available for computational access. So if you kind of try and think of your archive as a data set and sort of complete some of this information. So that's not about AI, but it is an interesting thing. And I think a lot of this is about these different perspectives. It is about kind of trying to look into this area to kind of shift your mental models and just sort of be aware of the different worldview, whether that's the worldview of the AI, machine learning, that is just seeing everything as numbers, but also the kind of fact that your archive might also be seen in that way, or as just numbers or data. And there's also developments in governance at the moment, which is good. I'm quite fond of the ICO in this, actually. I think they've got some good stuff out there. And they've done some, Information Commissioner's Office. So they've gone back to this idea of explanation, and they've got this kind of document which is all about kind of what kind of explanations might you need to offer, what kind of explanations might people realistically or reasonably expect from you. And so there's some quite good things there. So you can see on the left there the kind of types of explanation from the ICO, but also under the algorithmic transparency recording standard there, you can see the main headings. So these are sort of things that the standard asks people to document or to sort of write down in this recording standard. And you can see there's a lot of overlap here, and the same themes are coming up. So the risks, mitigations and impact assessment, that's where you're having to do the sort of things like not just impact and fairness and bias, but also security. You know, what have you actually done to think about how to make your system secure? And they've also, the ICO, there's another document which is a sort of emerging audit framework. But what's interesting about that, perhaps from our perspective, is it takes it into risk management. And what they have is they have kind of suggested risk mitigations for the different forms of risk that can come across, which is quite interesting because obviously that then takes us perhaps back into, again, our safe space, perhaps. So there's a lot going on in that space. I think it's probably not really evident, unfortunately, but I mean, I feel more optimistic that we are getting to grips with this, and that the kind of governance and audit is emerging that we need. Finally, then we get to this kind of idea of technology-assisted archival processing, and I think probably this is where I've ended up in terms of my what I think of AI and where I'm coming from, how I approach AI. So this is this computer, or one like it, not this one, sorry, but one very like it is the sort of computer on which the first computerized listing of an archival binding aid was done. It was done in East Sussex Record Office by Carl Newton back in the early 1970s. And this is perhaps the space that I've always been in. So I've long been in this kind of space of thinking about technology-assisted archival processing. And from this side, this sort of angle, AI is much more about that performing tasks. And it's about, is this about automation or is it not about automation? And in some ways, it's not about automation. So the fact that, for as long as there's been this technology, archivists have wanted to use it. And we've kind of understood that we have to kind of expand our knowledge of the kind of technological landscape more broadly, systems development. This is a quote from Anne Gilliland. So you see computer-mediated communication. This is a sort of, that was the 1990s that this sort of thing was being said. And it has been a paradigm shift. And it's not just a paradigm shift in terms of thinking about, what is a digital record and all of that. It's also a paradigm shift in actually having to think about about the kind of systems and sort of become almost technologists as well. We have to understand the technology on which our material is being held and used. So in some ways it's not about automation, but in a lot of ways it is, right? The quote at the bottom there is from David Bierman. That is 1990s again. And basically, you know, since the 1990s, we've known that what we're trying to do cannot be achieved with the methods we have at hand because of the scale, and that scale continues. You can see now why I put the other quote from Anne Gilliland on there. This is one of the first pieces of research in this kind of area. This was rules-based rather than machine learning in the 1990s, but it was this attempt to kind of develop this idea of a kind of automated assistant to help us with appraisal of email to some extent, or electronic communications. And so even back then we were kind of thinking about this and trying to work out how we can perhaps harness some of this new technology, new techniques to assist us in this. And so this is perhaps where, to be honest, I find myself more often. And then I also have to think about, for whom shall we spin straw into gold? And this is because I get cross quite a lot. No, this is because I feel that there's so much potential here, and there's a lot of interest. We know that this sort of new techniques do have a huge potential for generating insight from data, from pulling out knowledge extraction, if you like. So this is where GLAMs, galleries, libraries, archives and museums, are sort of interested in, and they're very interested in these kind of new techniques because of this sort of potential for knowledge extraction, and also this potential for metadata quality. And I kind of feel that there's a lot of work on the knowledge extraction at the research end, because isn't that what research is to some extent? Extracting knowledge from a kind of resources that we have. And that's good. But I'm worried that if we don't kind of also apply it at the upstream end, where the government knowledge and information management kind of angle is, we're not going to have anything, because we're not going to be able to bring it up into the resources. And that kind of whole thing about the life cycle versus the continuum is then in there. And on metadata quality, the other thing I would say that I'm finding, and this is why I'm also talking about that kind of wider systems angle, is that the reason Google works so well is A, it's got a lot of money, but B, it's also that it's kind of the structures that it's, you know, the internet is structured in a way to support the way it searches. And on metadata quality, I'm at the moment, this is just because this is where my headspace is at the moment, I feel that the jobs of restructuring all of our data from one sort of form to another form to another form to support whatever the search technology or whatever works best, to put it into a form that works best for the available search, is quite a lot of effort. So this is why I kind of struggle to kind of work where should I put my attention. There's so much potential here. I think it is quite important that you kind of think about where you want to focus at any particular time. So I'm going to end, and I'm going to say conclusion if only, because I do wish I could put this down and never think about it again sometimes. But this is where I'm at. So I would say you know, where I come from perhaps is number 2. That's where I sit, you know, and I'm very comfortable in this idea of good governance, the role of record keeping in that and all of that. Then looking out from there, I do want to do more perhaps on the understanding AI and learning how to interrogate it. I'm quite interested in, but I've not had time to think about it, around these, the way that people are learning or developing techniques to interrogate AI. So to sort of do counterfactual probes, which kind of maybe don't tell you exactly what's going on, but at least help you to sort of understand the basis on which kind of classifications are being made, perhaps. And then where I end up all of the time, and where I know I'm not going to be able to escape, is 3. It's that technology assisted processes. It's kind of dealing with the digital paradigm, dealing with that reality shift, dealing with the fact that our methods are out of sync with the magnitude of the task we have. And I'm going to stop there because I have rambled on long enough.
Great, thanks so much, Jenny. Thank you. everyone. So we have a question from Marcus, who's attending online, and he's saying, okay, for example, Google has a huge data set because, of course, we give a lot of information to Google on a daily basis. So what do you have any thoughts about, the scale of this data sets?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, the scale is huge, but then, to be honest, the scale of what I've got at the National Archives is quite huge. And I think it's about that. Well, it seems so to me. It may not be huge in Google terms, but it's enough for me, thanks. Is the knowledge layer. So I again, this is me showing the lack of knowledge that I have of these things, but it's this kind of idea that there's a knowledge graph, and that's what supports the search, and that's what perhaps makes it better. And I sometimes feel that what archives hold as their catalogue is also a knowledge graph to some extent, or it could be, yeah. So in the diagrams that Stephanie was showing, you had a kind of data set, and then you had this knowledge layer, right? I am the knowledge layer. The archive is the knowledge layer. The archival metadata is the knowledge layer. It's just that that is not structured in the right way. So I do think that we have the potential. I'm also really interested looking upstream, as I said, that these knowledge graphs, the sort of thing that Google are perhaps using, is now being generated within the systems that are being used, within SharePoint, within things like that. And I want access to that knowledge layer. That's what I want to be bringing across, because it's that knowledge layer that's also going to help me kind of work out what I've got and to preserve it. So I do find that a very interesting area. I haven't gone into it enough, and I know I'm not the expert on it, but this idea of a knowledge layer, and I do think that we could perhaps start to sort of reconceive archives perhaps as we have data, and then we have this knowledge layer, and you have to kind of work through the knowledge layer to kind of understand the data. People talk in terms of data lakes and things like that. So I think maybe that's where I'm thinking I might be moving.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. Another question from Anaïs, again online. How do you visualize the application of AI in knowledge extraction? So the question is really about visualization.
Well, the question of how you visualize the results, but how do I visualize what it's doing? That's a harder one, because that's about these mental models, isn't it? And it's kind of your mental model of what's going on in the black box. And to some extent, like I say, I don't like black box metaphor. I feel it's like misdirection. If you put a black box on the table, your eye is immediately drawn to it. You want to kind of know what's in it, and it's kind of almost misdirection. And that's why I'm more interested in kind of what's going in and what's going out, and kind of having a mental model that sees actually the statistics is actually less interesting to some extent. That is statistics, and if you understand statistics, it is not, but it's how you've kind of represented the world, what you're working on the basis of when you're feeding it in. That's where I kind of think, and I think that is very difficult to visualize, because as I understand it, natural language processing, your text is vectorized into multi-dimensional space, into a multi-dimensional vector. And I'm just going, can I visualize a multi-dimensional vector? No, I can't. Have I any idea what that looks like, apart from perhaps a long list of numbers in a chart? I don't know. So I do struggle with that, visualizing what's going in terms of how you visualize it on the way out. That's going to be dependent on what kind of information you want to convey with that visualization. So I think that's sort of more use case specific at that angle. So those are my thoughts on that.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. Another question from Danielle, who's asking about best practice. What are the best practice with AI to ensure that digital records are accessible? It's about best practice and access to those records.
Well, I think that's a difficult one, because in what way is AI implicated in access at the moment to some extent? So is there emerging best practice for procuring AI, if you like, or for thinking about the decision to use AI in any particular context? And I think there probably is. Yeah, there is an emerging best practice there. The sort of beginning of this sort of governance framework around, you should be doing impact assessments. You should be, if you're developing your own AI, you should be developing it with a multidisciplinary team. You should be developing developing it with, you know, stakeholders from the user communities who are going to be impacted with it. So there's a lot of best practice out there in terms of developing AI. You should be documenting what you're doing. You should have your data sheet, etc. In terms of how it's used in archives, there isn't best practice yet because it's emerging practice. We are only beginning to work out, you know, what are the best ways in which to use this within the sort of archival work process. We can obviously abide by these more general principles that would apply for any kind of AI project, but how it's used and what you should use it for, perhaps in archival practice, because that's also what best practice is about, isn't it? It's kind of what everybody agrees is good. I don't think we've got that yet.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jenny. Another question from Adrian about the fact that is AI, when we are talking about artificial intelligence, is it just about numbers or is it more complicated than that?
Sorry, have I been downgrading AI or it's just maths? I don't, again, I'm not the expert. I don't know. For me, as of my understanding is that quite a lot of the models are purely mathematical once you get into it to some extent. Yeah. Is there more to that than that? Obviously, it depends where you draw the boundaries again. So, you know, is there more to that? Obviously, there is. There's all the kind of, you know, in some ways, AI is not a thing. It's the people behind the AI. It's the way they're developing it. It's the culture in which it's being developed. So it isn't just maths. Clearly, it's not just maths. But I think at its heart, a lot of machine learning is about statistical methods. Yeah, I mean, it is about that. And I think that's difficult sometimes because in some ways AI takes on this kind of huge, we see it as this sort of threat. We see it as this intelligence. We see it as, you know, Terminator and taking over the world, and all of that's in there at the same time we think about it. And this is why I think it is worth everybody trying to at least sort of read as much as they can and look under the hood. And quite often it does come down to fast maths or lots of data.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Another question from Lorenzo, who's asking about artificial intelligence and appraisal. Could you perhaps expand a little bit about the role of artificial intelligence in appraising those digital records?
Yeah. I don't want to talk about the role of AI as a thing. I mean, I think what we need to talk about is technology-assisted appraisal. Yeah. So technology-assisted appraisal is definitely required. How we do that is going to, you know, be multiple ways, and it may or may not involve AI. So let's think about it. We could sort of decide that we're going, you know, what does AI do? Well, one thing that we can use, one technique that's been developed is sentiment analysis. So we're going to run sentiment analysis over all our records, and we're only going to select ones that are happy. You know, we could decide to do that. That's something we could do, but is that the way we want to appraise? No. So I think there's lots that can be done in terms of appraisal, in terms of thinking about how technology can assist us. You know, we can already do things like, you know, we've got some of these techniques, and we've also, to some extent, I think, got agreement on some things that we can do in terms of technology-assisted appraisal. We can do checksum comparison. We can more or less get rid of duplicates. We can quite easily get rid of temporary files and certain systems files that we know we don't want to keep. We can run, you know, regular expressions and find personal identifiable, you know, when it's a sort of number or pattern. You know, there's lots that we can do. It's just up to us now to work out which of those is, you know, going to work and how we do that. And beyond that, perhaps, you know, how we can perhaps use some things like natural language processing to maybe sort of pull out entities, and then that might also give us a bit of context in terms of seeing, you know, what entities are involved in a document, and does that. Basically, I think it's going back to Anne Gilliland to some extent. What she was doing was she was trying to work out the rules on which we make appraisal decisions, and she was going to experts in appraisal, and she was asking them, you know, on what basis do you make, you know, what contextual cues help you to make this decision? And I think that's also something that we haven't actually articulated terribly well just before AI. And in some ways, as with all technologies, it's that it has to be precisely described. So for AI, it's all about it can be precisely described enough for a machine to sort of simulate it, right? have we precisely described it enough? I do not know. And I think maybe that's where we could put some attention.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Jenny. Okay, so I think we had lots of questions from online attendees, and of course we have many people in the room. So do you have any questions at this point for Jenny? Anything you want to ask? I'm asking everyone in the room.
Everyone in the room wants lunch.
Well, I just have one question about sentiment analysis. I mean, do you think it's still early on, or, you know, is this technology, you know, developed enough? Because we are talking a lot about this, right? But is it really, you know, practiced and developed?
I don't know, because I haven't looked into it, so I don't know how well it performs. I just throw it out there as a, you know, what's possible doesn't necessarily mean it's useful to some extent. And also, to some extent, this idea that we're talking about technology assistance. So it's kind of what can we kind of, how can the technology give us an overview that allows us to perhaps, you know, it down. So it's kind of giving us a sense of the whole. Appraisal from an archival perspective has always, to some extent, involved getting enough of a sense of the whole so that you can sort of select enough to sort of preserve a sense of the whole without preserving the whole. And what I'm perhaps more interested in is how can we use this technology to read all this stuff faster than we can, because that's the basic bottom line. We can't read across it as quickly, and give us a sense of the whole that is going to be useful to us enough to kind of then understand where we need to be looking for our selection to some extent. I'm not talking about sensitivity review here, I'm talking about that. But sentiment analysis, it's just, you know, we're never going to do that, I don't think, because we're only going to keep everything that gives government in a positive light or gives our company in a positive light. That's not going to happen.
Great, fantastic. Stephanie has a question now.
Yeah, maybe just to quickly butt in. You made this point around the explainable AI, which I find is really fascinating concept, this idea that AI needs to be explainable for us, and people expect them to be able to understand each step as to how a result is delivered. And at the same time, I find these are also the people who seem to think that AI can do anything and can reproduce human intelligence and come up with these incredible assumptions and can identify things that maybe humans themselves would even struggle to identify. And I'm thinking, if you want a tool to do that, or to even get close to that level of functionality, it is not going to be explainable. I'm actually wondering in how far AI is ever going to be useful for us if it is explainable in those terms. And that's why I liked your distinction between explaining and interpreting. And that's just a part I'd really like to hear more about, because I'm not sure whether you agree with me that explainable AI might be useless AI. And also, what would it mean to interpret rather than explain AI?
Yeah, and I think I do still struggle. Like I say, I struggle with the distinction myself. I mean, I think you're right that ultimately you can't step by step through some AI these days, deep neural nets and whatever. You can't follow it in that way. So it's thinking in a different way, if you like, to us. It's got a different worldview, and that's a numerical worldview to some extent, or a statistical worldview. It's processing, it's reasoning on that basis. So I don't think an explanation of that is going to be possible in human terms, if you like, because an explanation of that in human terms, A, may not be possible because you can't see it enough, but B, it would probably involve doing a degree in statistics or something, and you don't want to be doing that. So I think you're right, and that's what the difference is. There's the kind of perhaps knowing what's going on to some extent, in as much as having a sense of what the mechanics are, and the mechanics are, as we've discussed, and that kind of idea of explaining. And this is why the relationship with record keeping and governance comes in, because artificial intelligence is something that's perhaps just doing natural language processing and identifying, you know, predicting what next word based on lots. I can understand that, but it's when it's decision making, when the AI is seen as having an intelligence, when we sort of use it as an excuse to some extent. I think that's the danger with AI, and that's why I'm explaining. We're just sort of, we have to be careful that, yes, we accept that we can't understand it and explain it on one level, but on the other level, we can't then use it as an excuse. We can't say, well, we're going to abdicate all the responsibility for decision making. The algorithm made me do it. that kind of, the algorithm said so, and no, I can't explain how. And that's not about the AI, that's just about us and whether we're going to accept that people. Does that make any sense?
No, I mean, but the decisions of whether you get a mortgage or not because the system said so, that is hard to accept. But I mean, there's so many different uses for AI, and I'm just wondering that this question of interpretation maybe lies in different points depending on where and how and what we use as AI.
Yeah. And I think that's why we do need to understand what's going on. We do need to understand the mechanics, and we have to be honest about what it's actually doing and what it's not.
Yeah, fantastic. So we have a question from Sean online, who's asking about commercial AI developers. Are they interested in the archives, in the record keeping market, or not at all?
Well, there's quite a strong commercial information management systems market. Are they interested? I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of development in this area. And one thing that we are doing as part of Inter Pares Trust, or one thing that Inter Pares Trust is doing, is a kind of survey of the kind of products that are out there. So looking at all of the kind of information management and the, records management, from SharePoint to Microsoft to everything else, all of those kind of systems, and sort of looking at them in terms of what they're sort of saying in the marketing. And a lot of this stuff is being sold as AI enabled, and Inter Pares Trust is trying to sort of get a little bit under that and talk to the companies involved to actually work out, well, in what way is it AI enabled? So I think that there's a huge kind of, as with all commercial kind of, that's the whole point, is you've got to have the kind of edge, haven't you, over your competitors. You've got to be able to do something. But I think that what I would recommend anybody who's looking at this is to again, ask the hard questions. So it's AI enabled. What does that mean? What technique is being used? Are you using just rules based, or are you using some form of machine learning? So I would very much suggest that, is there an interest in selling us stuff? Yes. Is there an interest in kind of explaining it, if you like? No.
Great. I think we have one question here.
So thinking about technology assisted appraisal sensitivity review selection. So I remember one such project came about in TNA and Cabinet Office around about 2015, looking at e-discovery tools and the potential for them to play a role in this, but it feels like not much has happened beyond that. What's it going to take for that to become business as usual, the norm, rather than what it feels like at the moment? It's more of a kind of niche pilot type concern.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This was about whether there's this opportunity of moving it forward. So the fact that we had experiments at the National Archives as well around e-discovery systems and the use of that for technology assisted sensitivity review in sort of 2015. How do we kind of move it forward to business as usual? And I think that's a really tricky one, because I think what that involves for a lot of archives and a lot of organizations is that commercial. It's about that industry archive kind of communication. And I look back with my sort of maybe my archival description finding hat, which is where I came from, the way in which we have sort of the product that leads, and then you kind of everybody uses the same product, and then that technology becomes standard. So I think what I would say that we do need to consider and think about in that space is, and that sort of goes back to what I was saying about the systems landscape, we need to be more technology savvy, and we need to be not just more technology savvy in understanding the technology, but also in the whole system in which that technology evolves, and that involves also the kind of commercial offerings and how we kind of connect with those. So in some ways, how do we do that? We probably just need to keep chipping away and trying to get the archival voice acknowledged in some of these systems, the Microsoft user group and people like this. This is how we perhaps, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight. But I think it will, that's one way of doing it, I think. And that's something that we sometimes don't see as part of this.